Hi, I'm Phil DeVol, and I'm associated with the Bridges Out of Poverty movements that you might have heard about, and I've written a couple books on the topic. And we have some real champions in different sectors, and one of them is Melissa Knopp that I would like to introduce to you today. She's an attorney, and she has a lot of experience with the Bridges work. And I'll let her introduce herself because I think she was real close to the Supreme Court at the time, working there with the judges and so on. We'll dig into what her experience has been with the Bridges material.
So as Phil said, my name is Melissa Knopp. I am an attorney, and I actually started out working in one of the trial courts in Butler County, Ohio, where I was the first coordinator for one of our first felony drug courts in the state. And I also served as a magistrate in probate court and handled such dockets as adoption, guardianship, civil commitment for folks with mental health issues, and minor settlement and estate cases. From there, I moved to the Ohio Supreme Court, where I was the manager of the specialized docket section, which is what we call in Ohio our drug courts, our mental health courts, all of those types of programs, reentry courts, domestic violence. I mean, there's so many versions of specialized dockets, but in Ohio, we call them specialized dockets. I know in other states, they've been called treatment courts, problem-solving courts. So just wanted to make sure I stated what we called them, because I'll refer to specialized dockets quite a bit. When I was at the Ohio Supreme Court, I was the manager of the specialized docket section and was responsible for the development and creation of these programs across the state. Specialized dockets began in the mid-90s, which is when I began my career in the trial court. And in the late 90s is when I moved to the Ohio Supreme Court. I first met Phil at a Bridges Out of Poverty training. I think one of the early trainings that they were doing in Ohio at the time when the book first came out. And for me, in specialized dockets, we always focus on providing services to make folks in the criminal justice system with substance abuse or mental health issues more successful. And the goal, as with all folks in criminal justice, is to eliminate recidivism and make sure that people are successful in their future without coming back through our system. So I work a lot with probation. I still work a lot with probation. I left the Supreme Court in 2013, and I currently work for a foundation out of Hudson, Ohio, PEGS Foundation, which funds the Ohio Stepping Up Project, which is a national project by the Council of State Governments, the American Psychiatric Foundation, and the National Association of County Executives to find alternatives for folks with mental health issues out of the criminal justice system, and to make sure that the crisis systems in the community, the treatment systems in the community are where they need to be so that folks with these issues don't end up in criminal justice.
You're one of the first people from the criminal justice system, from the legal world, to adapt our work. And there are some real wins there. So do you have like a concrete example of people that use the Bridges work in a court setting or legal setting of some sort that you can share with us?
Sure. So when I first was exposed to Bridges, it made so much sense to me because it was addressing a lot of the issues that we were trying to address with folks who were under supervision in criminal justice. And it really pronounced for me issues that we needed to stress with not only our judges, but with our probation officers to help work with people. When I first started looking at this work in the late 90s, I think it's important to understand that criminal justice was in a far different place than it currently is. Back in those days, the majority of probation officers were retired law enforcement officers. So they didn't really have the concept of working with people. They were just compliance officers. And if someone didn't comply, then they basically threw the book at them, which was sending them to jail for long periods of time with no treatment, with no resources, and ultimately no skills or no help. So when we started specialized dockets, it really was a new movement in criminal justice. And it really was a change of a mindset for not only judges, but probation officers to develop relationships with the folks coming through the system that were being supervised. That was an unheard of concept at the time. And so a lot of times our programs were labeled Hug a Thug because we talked with folks and we worked with them. And that wasn't the typical process that was used in criminal justice. So we skip ahead 20 years later, and criminal justice has come a long way. Most of our probation officers now are degreed folks in criminal justice. There are several, bachelor degree programs, master, PhD programs available now from universities that didn't exist in the late 80s, early 90s. And the concept has really changed in criminal justice and become more accepted that we need to work with folks and teach them skills that they don't have so that they can stay out of the criminal justice system instead of just being compliance officers. So when I was first exposed to Bridges, I worked a lot with the first 20 or so drug courts that we had operating in Ohio, just trying to figure out a two-pronged approach. The first prong was looking at probation and how we could make probation more meaningful and more effective for folks. And then also we looked at court case processing and procedure to see were the rules and the processes we were using with folks in the court system there because, it was a administration of justice issue or a public safety issue? Or was it just because this is the way we always did stuff and nobody ever really thought about it? So when I was working with my specialized docket judges and I would expose them to this training, because that was one of the big pieces of how I started educating the judges and the probation officers, is I hosted several trainings with Phil throughout the state. Poor Phil, I drug him all throughout Ohio. But I really felt if I could expose people to the concepts and let them see that there was a better way to do things, that we could work and put our heads together and come up with better processes, procedures, again, that would make folks successful in our programs. So when we first started out, I really targeted the judges because the judges in a courtroom are the ones that control process, procedure. And a lot of times their sentencing philosophy really controls how a probation officer will interact with the person under supervision. As far as how much non-compliance can the probation officer deal with until the judge wants them to bring that person back in front of them. So when we look at process and procedure, again, I challenge my judges to look at their court calendars, how cases flow, and how they're scheduling folks in the community to make sure that they are actually meeting the needs of our customers that we serve and not just making sure that it works for the court. So with processes and procedures, we looked at how they were scheduling cases. I had one county court that had criminal cases that they would deal with on a Tuesday. And a lot of it was sentencing offenders who'd already been found guilty, who had already had pre-sentence investigations conducted on them. And the judge would call folks in on Tuesday. She'd have her sentencing hearings. And then as soon as the person who was convicted came before the judge, she would tell them, come back tomorrow and meet with the probation officer, and the probation officer will get you all set. Well, this was a very rural county. There was no public transportation. And what we found is about 80% of the folks that appeared before her for sentencing failed to appear before her the next day to meet with the probation officer. So already on day one of supervision, these folks were non-compliant. And when they didn't show up for court, what would happen is they would issue a warrant on these folks. And so this county in particular had about 60,000 outstanding warrants for folks. Part of it, non-failure, there's other reasons they issue warrants, but there was a large percentage of those warrants that were just for failure to appear. No other crime, no other reason, but they just weren't able to make it back to court the next day. So when the judge took a look at this, after being exposed to Bridges and going through the training and reading the book, she made a simple change. And that simple change was when they were sentencing folks, instead of saying, be back here tomorrow, she would ask them, when can you be back in court over the next 7 days? And she would just be considerate of the fact that folks have transportation issues, that they have all of the other agency time that they have to spend, and letting the person schedule with them when they can come back in to meet with their probation officer. they were able to cut the no-show rate by 60% just by making that small little change. So again, it's just recognizing that the folks we are dealing with are people with very chaotic lives, and that instead of us telling them what they need to do, just working with them to schedule their meetings with their court personnel that they have to meet with, which is a luxury that pretty much most other sectors avail people. But we in the court system were very rigid and did not. Um, Another area that I found that Bridges was extremely helpful, and especially working with probation, basically core correctional practices that probation officers follow. And one of the key core correctional practices is the relationship developed with the person that you're supervising. I always found that Bridges Out of Poverty was very helpful for probation officers to understand how to develop an appropriate relationship with the folks that they are supervising. And that just taking basic consideration into account when they're dealing with folks, not only on scheduling, but on developing case plans, bringing people to the table. A lot of this stuff is more normalized in criminal justice, but when we were first on this 20 years ago, it was not. And it was, like I said, kind of an outlier concept. I'm happy to say that we've evolved a lot in criminal justice, and people are trained now on using some of these concepts, but that was not the case many years ago.
So, I do remember going all over the state with you, and it would be, I don't know if it was 1 or 2 days, but it was a pretty significant effort we put in. And then I think you had a follow-up with them that lasted for about a year, where they come back and talk about the kind of changes that they were making. So they got to process that together. So just out of curiosity, which of the Bridges concepts do you think was most significant for them? I mean, I'm thinking about things like, the instability factors or the low resources that people might have. We talk about the 11 resources. Or is it language issues? Or is it that it's a relationship-based growth? What was it that clicked, do you think, for people that were being trained?
Honestly, I think it was all of those concepts, because like I said, at the time, no one was addressing those, and no one was presenting to court staff that you could take these things into consideration as you supervise folks and still be successful at supervising them, teach folks the skills, recognizing that the folks that we supervise are problem solvers. I think our approach in criminal justice for many years have been, I'm the person of knowledge. I'm going to tell you what to do to make your life better. I think recognizing that our court system, our supervision systems are all based on middle-class values and usually run by middle-class folks. But the folks that we deal with in criminal justice in the court system, I'd say 85% or more of them come from a background of poverty. So I think that the hidden rules of class were very informative. I had so many probation officers tell me they could not understand when they would go home to do home visits how someone would be so far behind on paying their fines at court, but when they walked into their house, they had a big screen TV and they had the latest gaming console. And it was educating them on the concept of, people in poverty live in chaos. They don't get vacation time like us middle class people do, so they're taking their leisure any way they can to get out of the stressful situation that they're put into. And so that's why, how folks use money. Us in middle class, we save. If we were in the criminal justice system, we'd probably pay off our fines so we could get out and move forward. But folks in supervision positions in criminal justice didn't understand, how folks that they were supervising would spend money and why the court wasn't prioritized at the top of that list on how they would use the money that they did receive. So there's so many concepts in here that I think that are applicable to criminal justice, and educating probation officers just to have a better understanding. The hidden rules of class, I think, were most informative. And when I was training a lot of court personnel, I would always start with those quizzes. Can you survive in poverty? Can you survive in middle class? Can you survive in wealth? And what I would do a lot of times with court staff is I would give them the wealth quiz first, so that they could feel kind of the discomfort of not knowing what the hidden rules of a different socioeconomic class are. And then I would try to relate it back to, this is the experience the people we're supervising are having when you talk with them, because you're not coming from the same mindset or the same hidden rules based on how you were raised or what the process and procedures for this societal institution based on middle class values is.
You know, I'm thinking now about the entire continuum of how the criminal justice system works, from the street where their people are interacting with the police all the way through prison and restoration, that entire continuum. And over the years, because we were working together in 2000, 2002, and 2003, right in that period of time. And so we have a book for people that are coming out of prison, for example, and we have a book for first responders. And I just wonder where on the continuum, or this is like an unfair question, really, but where on the continuum do we need to put the most emphasis to have a good impact for the people that are under-resourced and living in an unstable world? Would it be at the beginning of that continuum? Where can we have a big impact on that so that it's a system that's more fair and equitable, I would say?
I think targeting the probation officers and the judges, because first of all, the judges set the tone. The judges kind of will tell their probation officers, how, like I said before, what their sentencing philosophy is, how much they want the probation officer to work with that person before they bring them back in to deal with non-compliance issues. The first responder book, I've used that quite a bit because I think that really helps folks in probation, in the supervision area, really understand the amount of information that you actually are receiving from the folks that you supervise. If you take the time to listen to their stories and you take the time to actually have conversations with folks. The reentry book is very helpful, but most folks don't go to prison. I think most folks, they may spend some time in a county jail, and reentry from a county jail is very different from reentry in a prison because of the time frames. They're not in county jail quite as long. And most people in the county jail are in on a pretrial status. This is one of the things that the other project that I worked on is really looking at, is we don't have a lot of convicted folks in county jail. About 70% of the population in your county jail are people sitting there on pretrial who can't make bond. And that's why you see a lot of the reform efforts right now on cash bail and cash bond, because we have people sitting in jail for very low level offenses who can't make maybe $100 or a $500 bond. Again, I think if we educate the judges on coming up with alternatives for cash bond, to understand that, there's other things that folks can put at the table that'll make sure that they reappear in court without forcing them to sit in jail, because it's very expensive for taxpayers to have non-violent, non-convicted folks sitting in jail. It's like $75 a day to have someone sit in jail, and to have a non-convicted person sit in jail, have that disrupt their life. Maybe they lose their job, their housing. You're just making the problem for that person much, steeper and harder for them to solve once they actually get the case resolved. And, they may be placed on supervision or they may be found not guilty.
I'm so glad you clarified that and centered it down on the judges. And then I thought to myself, it was the judges that became the champions. I'm thinking about Judge Carol Robb and Judge Ballinger and Judge Jennifer Bruner. And then there's a fellow that was in juvenile courts from down south. I can't remember his name just now.
Judge Schreiber.
Yeah. And, that's where we had the traction then.
It was. And the judges set the tone for the courtroom. So if you get the judges on board, they'll set the tone for the prosecutors. Prosecutors will get more interested, and the defense attorneys. Many times the defense attorneys or the public defenders are just focused on clearing the case for the current person. I currently serve on the Public Defender Commission for Delaware County. We're the oversight board for the Public Defender's Office for that county. And it's been interesting to me as I've served on this board as a commissioner that the public defenders aren't really focused on the long-term picture of the person. They're just focused on the case before them, which we want folks to be focused on both. You know, it's like resolving the case before you right now with a jail stint without any services or connecting folks to some of the need areas that they have that will help prevent them from coming back in the system is a little hard concept for public defenders to grasp, because of course they want, you know, to get their person off, and they're trial attorneys, and trial attorneys are very focused on their record of wins and losses. But trying to get them to look at, okay, maybe if you put them on probation for a year and the person was able to get services that they were otherwise not able to access, which actually is a whole nother problem. I'm not suggesting that folks all should go through criminal justice to access services, but unfortunately, the society we live in today, that's the case in many counties in this country, in Ohio, and especially in the rural counties. So again, that's why we're kind of looking a little further up in the system. When I was working with you at the Ohio Supreme Court, that was actually a 4-year project. I had written a memo to my higher ups, and what we had looked at is we had different processes in each year. So the first year we spent training all the judges and court staff. I made the trainings free. I paid for them out of my budget at the Supreme Court. And what I would do is during these trainings, I would really focus or hone in on who was so interested in this and would ask questions, and who was engaged and who just kind of was there to get their continuing education credit, or, you know, who didn't really participate. Once we identified those folks, and I think I'd probably talk to you a lot at the breaks over these trainings, then I would hone in on those judges and those courts and see if they wanted to participate in our project. So what we did after the first year when we trained them, we just did the 1-day training, got everybody trained. The next year, what I did was a train the trainer for the 8 courts that we focused on. I required that the judge be at the table, because I knew if the judge wasn't involved, we'd never get anywhere. So I had the judges put together teams. I think I gave each of them 10 slots at this train the trainer. And, you know, not all of them took that many slots, but I wanted to make sure that they could train whoever they felt were key folks in their court system to make changes. So after we did the train the trainer, then what we would do is I'd bring you, Phil, back down to the Supreme Court once a quarter. I'd have the courts come in. We would do like a meeting from 10 to 2. I'd feed them lunch so I wouldn't lose them over the lunch hour. But we would sit and we would just have group discussions about the changes folks were able to make. In addition to having discussions, I would require the courts to, and I'd usually target the judges on this again, to write articles about what they were able to do. So we ran a whole series of articles on the changes these judges made in their court systems, their local court systems. Again, I gave them the task of how this affects the administration of justice. You know, they knew that the changes weren't supposed to affect public safety, which we really didn't have a problem with that. But we just kind of outlined some parameters, and we just turned the groups loose. And then when we brought them back in at this quarterly meetings, we would just discuss, was it successful? Was it useful? You know, if stuff was working well, they would do a article. So that was year 2 and 3. And then year 4, we were moving into building the bridges community. And what we had asked the judges to do was to reach out to their community members that a lot of them were already working with. A lot of times, and I think you remember this probably from Columbiana County, where the judge brought in the employers, because that's always a challenge in the court system, is finding employment for people with convictions. A lot of times they can't get certain license, or you know, there's just a lot of obstacles that having either a felony or a misdemeanor conviction on your record has for employment. So, you know, using the cascade engineering model, we brought in some local employers. Again, we had you come in and talk to the local employers about how cascade engineering put the stuff in, the expense it is when you have low-level staff who turn over frequently, the expense that costs for the company employing folks, and just kind of trying to work with them again on these little process and procedure things that us in middle class take for granted, because, you know, we all have cars and we all are used to a 9 to 5 schedule and those kind of things. just really thinking about, how your business operates and how are you working with your employee. And I think now with the workforce shortages that we see across the country in all sectors, employers really need to start having those discussions and consider the life cycle of the employee a lot more. So that was where we got with the fourth year, and we only had a few communities that made it kind of to that point. We kept all the other ones in, but Marion County, as you know, was one of our champions. Columbiana County, and they were really able to start bringing the community in to really build a full Bridges community and not just have it be a Bridges project in the court system.
I think, Melissa, you must feel a great deal of satisfaction to see those things, the fruit of all of that, because those, the impact they had in their communities is really, really strong. And when a judge calls a meeting, people show up. And if they want to build a Bridges collaborative in their community, it does happen. And I think that you must take great joy from Jennifer Bruner, who became our Secretary of State and is now on the Supreme Court, who is such a strong advocate for this kind of work too. And so that must be really satisfying for you.
I gotta say, I kind of fell out of the Bridges community for a little bit when I left the Supreme Court. And now that I've re-engaged, it's very impressive for me just to see how much these groups have evolved over the years, how the Bridges work has evolved. I know initially when you and I started working, and I would always probably drive you crazy with my question, okay, but how do we implement this in the courts? And I specifically, your answer to me was always the same. You're the expert in the courts. You guys need to figure that out, but I think that now we have enough folks using these materials in all the different sectors that we can provide a little more support and information on areas that can be changed, using the Bridges concepts and how beneficial it is to the big picture and to your overall success if you just make these little tweaks. We're not asking for big changes. It's more developing it's stuff that we do naturally, but maybe that we didn't choose to do with these different folks that we were working with. So it's very exciting to see that people still embrace it, they still use it, and how successful some of these communities have become because of it.
I'm so glad to have you back in it. And I think that this interview that we've just had with you is going to inspire the communities to reach out to their judges. And
I'm happy to help anybody, how to
Great.
talk with the judge, how to encourage it, because one of the things that I've found over the years is that judges can get very defensive when you start telling them how stuff doesn't operate correctly in the courts. So it's the approach is I think something that just needs a little honing so we don't make folks defensive, because I had that experience. I mean, not everybody that Phil and I approached embraced this stuff. And I'm sure Phil remembers some of the communities that we did these trainings in. It became a very hostile training for what we were just, trying to teach. So it's interesting to me how people react. And I think a lot of it, what I've learned over the 20 years of my career, is a lot of it is the approach that you take, and how you approach people and how you start having conversations. The thing I love the most about Bridges and getting ahead is that folks are labeled investigators, and we just send them out to investigate how stuff operates. Many of the folks that we deal with in criminal justice have never had that opportunity. They've never had anybody ask them. All through their life, whether it was school or whatever institution they were dealing with, people just told them what to do, but never discussed with them or talked with them or got their feedback on, okay, well, how does this work for you? And that's the thing I think I really learned the most out of using all of the Bridges information.
Yeah. Well, it's so good to be back working with you again. And thanks for taking the time for going through this interview with me. I'm sure it's going to kind of rattle some folks' imagination, and we'll be hearing more about the Bridges communities going out. We want to get back into that work. So thank you, Melissa. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed working with you over the years, and I just think this work is so very critical to what we do in criminal justice.
Well, let me end by saying that if there's anyone that's watching this that wants to have Melissa come to your community and help you work on criminal justice issues and work with the courts, please get a hold of us. We're going to put up our number. You know how to get a hold of us, and she can be in your community working directly with your Bridges community and with you to get this done.